winner of the Carnegie Hero Fund Awards. Next week, our fall speaker series concludes with an inside look at our judiciary system with Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas Judge Arnie Klein, sponsored by Adele and Warren Suffren. Tonight, we return to the news with our dear friend and ally, George Savarese. George is an award-winning and much beloved teacher and model UN coach at Mount Lebanon High School. Both my daughters consider him one of the all-time greats. He's had a long and distinguished radio career and has taught at the Pennsylvania Governor's School for International Studies. George is often asked to speak in academic and community groups on foreign policy issues. You also know him as a regular speaker at First Mondays and at Concordia. Tonight, George's topic is Israel's 9/11, the short and long-term implications. We thank an anonymous donor who has generously sponsored tonight's talk. And we thank the Ash family for sponsoring tonight's reception, even though part of the Ash family, Neil, couldn't partake in person since he is out of town and, as we all know, is joining us tonight on Zoom. Finally, we thank Chris Benton for stepping in at the last moment to run our tech and for everything she does to support our Bethel community in general and our adult ed in particular. We are so grateful. And now it is my honor to welcome George to the podium.
I would come just for Bernice's introduction, but I came tonight and Neil had talked to me months ago about what topic we should go with. And we had discussed US and China relations and the next Cold War that is occurring between the United States and China. And then after the events of October 7, we've decided you can't speak about US-China relations when the Middle East is engulfed in a tragedy that was begun with a massacre on October 7th. And as we look and continue to undergo all of the things that have defined this, there are many, many, many facets and many different things to examine, many different things to analyze. Tonight, what I'd like to try and do is look at the parallels between 9/11 and the tragedies of 9/11 and Israel's 9/11, which occurred on October 7th. Except when we put things in perspective, we lost 3,000 people on 9/11 of a population of 340 million. Israel lost 1,400 innocent people in a population of 9.3 million. And when we look at the most salient points, I want to bring out a few. The Wall Street Journal, which I think has done a very credible job of examining important points, said, Israel has an obligation to do what it can to protect civilians. But because Hamas places its weapons and fighters in heavily populated areas, using innocent Palestinians as human shields, it's inevitable that some innocent civilians will die. But the world must remember the responsibility for those deaths will lie with Hamas. And to blame Israel amounts to denying a country the right to self-defense and granting Hamas a terrorist sanctuary. I thought that was a very salient point. I think we should also, for a moment, look at perhaps Joe Biden in his finest hour. Because President Biden's unequivocal support for Israel and forcefully calling out Hamas's barbarism and asserting Israel's right to defend itself offered moral clarity amid darkness and told devastated Israelis what they desperately needed to hear. And as misguided leftists denounced Israel and the American right drifted in an ethical void, Biden bravely traveled to Tel Aviv, to console the bereaved and give courage to those in fear. And that's leadership. Unlike Donald Trump, who made comments which just are inexplicable and mind-boggling, that somehow he's angry at Benjamin Netanyahu for recognizing the 2020 election and then referring to Hamas and Hezbollah as smart. Okay, if you want to say the attack was planned out and caught Israel completely by surprise, but to say they were smart would be like after 9/11 saying that Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, oh, they're so smart. No. They planned out an attack which was absolute, bloodthirsty and savage. And to refer to them as smart in that time, and then to say, he was taken out of context. He put that on Twitter. And I have an issue with Elon Musk. Elon Musk, who's decided anything is fine on Twitter. It's free speech. But there's a distinction between free speech and hate speech. And for Elon Musk to say there should be no filter, there should be no attempt to sort out what anyone wishes to spew out, what does that accomplish? It inflames, it causes violence, it increases this reactive feeling, and again, to just hide behind the cloak of free speech. Yes, on college campuses, as misguided as I think many of the voices I've heard, some of them, that's free speech, okay. But again, when free speech becomes hate speech, where is it simply acceptable to say that's okay? And the fury that is everywhere is also in many cases palpable from many, and we understand that. But Hamas violated international law by deliberately hiding its control centers and weapons in schools, in hospitals, apartment buildings. And Hamas, in many ways, wants the narrative to be Israel is striking civilians, because that makes it seem as though Hamas are the victims, and that helps them throughout the Middle East increase the support for them that was not there in other Arab countries. My friends, for many, many, many years, Hamas, an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood, has been shunned by Egypt, which wants no part of this group, which is attached again to Muslim Brotherhood, which wants to control Egypt, and throughout the Middle East. All of these countries, the Abraham Accords of 3 years ago, with the UAE and Bahrain signing a peace agreement with Israel, and Saudi Arabia being on the precipice of signing its own agreement with Israel, because Saudi Arabia realized they really have no enemy in Jerusalem. They have no enemy in Israel. The common enemy of Saudi Arabia and Israel was Iran, and still is. And so when Hamas attacks like this, think about where their motivation lie. Not only in the massacre of innocents, but also in the fact that they are hoping that this can spread to a wider war, and also because they are hopeful that this will prevent Saudi Arabia from reaching any agreement with Israel, which it was very, very close to doing. This makes it almost impossible for Saudi Arabia in the near future. I think long term it's still the same, because the national interests of these countries haven't fundamentally changed. At this point, they're nervous about their populations and people in the streets. And so that is why you had Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority cancel their meeting with Joe Biden after the attack on the hospital, which by the way, fascinating it is to see that attack on the hospital is now being, by U.S. officials, confirmed that the conclusion was it was a misfired rocket from Islamic Jihad from Gaza. It was not an Israeli airstrike. And I had friends who came to me and said, could you believe that Israel blew up a hospital? And my first reaction was, well, let's get the facts first. Let's find out what the facts are, because that didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And then this weekend, AP, CNN, and the Wall Street Journal each published video analysis that concluded the cause of the hospital explosion was a misfired rocket from Gaza, not an Israeli airstrike. Islamic Jihad, which, by the way, at times was a rival of Hamas in Gaza, Islamic Jihad, remember, fired 10 rockets at Israel. And one misfired and landed at the hospital. And my feeling is, what if that one would have hit an Israeli hospital instead? They would have been dancing in the streets. And instead, they fired and they committed the worst act of barbarism in Gaza. And then, did you notice how quickly that Hamas backed away? And from the start, all of the evidence was that the shrapnel that occurred with that blast was the shrapnel of rockets being used by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. It did not match the shrapnel of what Israel had used to fire rockets at Hamas targets in Gaza. US officials, Canadian officials, French officials all say the same thing. It was a rocket fired by a Palestinian terrorist group, attempting again, this sort of gets lost, attempting again to fire 10 rockets at Israel. The other thing that was bothersome was it was first reported that 500 died in the hospital blast. And I'm not attempting to discount the importance of 150 people dying, but there was not 500. And again, it's the manipulation of numbers to manipulate the crowds in the streets and to manipulate the events. And think about it. Biden had to speak by phone to the presidents of Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority because they could not be seen having a meeting with him after this terrible blast that Israel had done to a hospital and innocent civilians. But the fact remains, Egypt wants no part of Hamas. We had to convince Egypt and Prime Minister Netanyahu to allow humanitarian supplies to come through. And that has begun and should happen. I think pretty much everyone was in agreement. Allowing humanitarian supplies into Gaza to innocent people was the right thing to do. The fear, of course, was, would Hamas try to get their hands on it? But Egypt could have said, we will allow refugees and innocent civilians to come out of Gaza, and we'll form refugee camps in the Sinai. They did not. Egypt doesn't want any part of Hamas, and partly because Egypt is afraid that the spillover from Gaza into Egypt will be incredibly costly to them, and they will then have a permanent settlement of Palestinians from Gaza in Egypt. And let's face it, folks, if you speak to moderate Palestinians, they will tell you they have received very little support over the years from other Arab countries. They will make a case that Israel was not doing the right thing by not going along with this idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. But I was depressed in 2001 after the Palestinians rejected the attempt at Camp David by Bill Clinton, along with Ehud Barak, when Yasser Arafat sat at Camp David for 2 weeks, offered 90% of the West Bank and 1/3 of Jerusalem, and Yasser Arafat said no. He said, I can't agree to this. I would be a dead man if I agreed to this. And instead rejected 90% of the West Bank and Gaza and 1/3 of Jerusalem as a Palestinian state. I would like to argue that Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority have been marginalized over the years marginalized by Hamas, also should have been given a lot more weight and negotiations by Prime Minister Netanyahu and by other Arab countries, so that they were seen as the moderate Palestinians willing to recognize and sit down with Israel. Because let's remember, folks, all of the outpouring from what I call inexplicable groups in the United States for Hamas, Hamas has never wanted to recognize the right of Israel to exist. They have always said, our goal is the elimination of Israel, and they did a barbaric attack on innocent people. These are not people to sit down and negotiate with. This is not a group of people you can say, well, they're arguing their position, they're arguing a just cause. That's like saying, we should sit down with Osama bin Laden and we should sit down with Al-Qaeda after 9/11. Can you imagine? Let's remember, we went to Afghanistan 3 weeks after 9/11 to find Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden because they had carried out the worst act of terrorism on the United States mainland in our history. And mistakes were made. We rushed in, mistakes were made. But imagine, again, an attack in the United States. Can you imagine a drug gang from Mexico? Can you imagine going across the border into Texas? Beyond belief, acts of horrific torture, violence, and murder against people in Texas. And then going back across the border into Mexico, what would be the U.S. response to that? The U.S. would have been outraged. We would have said the forces of moral justice are on our side to go into Mexico and find them. And to go after the source of this so it could never happen again. And any country that saw a massacre like October 7th would have reacted with, we must make sure we go after the group responsible for doing this and go after them so that they have no place to attempt to hide and initiate another attack. Several key points. Israel has, to me, been amazing in the volunteer efforts across the country to supply troops with protective gear that some say the government is failing to provide. I have Israeli friends who say, our government has been slow in providing everything that the reservists need. I understand you're calling up 300,000 reservists, but you're talking about individual groups at the expo outside of Tel Aviv, the convention center, who've put together an amazing amount of donations to not only the soldiers, but also to any people who've been displaced or in need. And at Boston's Logan International Airport, volunteers approached passengers lined up to check into an El Al flight to Tel Aviv. They had giant boxes and duffel bags filled with donations for troops and were sending them with volunteers as checked luggage. Now, to me, the Israeli Defense Forces have to do better because in a statement to NPR, the IDF said, we have now set up a round-the-clock hotline for military personnel to report any shortages and emphasized that it is providing full logistical support for everyone, including medical gear, combat supplies, personal essentials. And that was because of the volunteer efforts and the volunteer projects done by Israeli civilians. And a lot of those people, regardless of their political leanings, some of them for 10 months were protesting against the far-right religious government effort to weaken the judiciary last summer. But today, the politics have all been pushed aside. And if anything, that has been an amazing, amazing show of unity that I find incredibly inspiring. These are people with great pride who are showing in a time of crisis, just like after 9/11 we saw in the United States, that Israel right now will come together and will channel its pain into something essential. And the quote from one of the volunteer coordinators at the expo was, "When you're under the kind of post-traumatic stress that people are going through, having seen the massacre that happened in people's houses, they want to be occupied, they want to be busy, and they want to be helpful. They want to be doing things." That to me was also very inspiring. It's also disturbing to me, ladies and gentlemen, that the United States does not have an ambassador to Israel. I don't know if any of you are aware of this. I'm sure some of you are. We do not have an ambassador to Israel or Egypt because in July, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Tom Nides, retired. And in early September, President Biden named Jack Lew, the former U.S. Secretary of Treasury, who is an Orthodox Jew, as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. Why is it being held up? There's no Speaker of the House. They can't confirm an ambassador at a time of crisis. And when this happened, there was no U.S. ambassador to Israel and no U.S. ambassador to Egypt. The State Department has top positions that haven't been filled. The U.S. Agency for International Development has been without a top official for the Middle East for 3 years. What does that mean? It means that our diplomacy for the United States is suffering. And it means that it's almost to the point where you wonder in the U.S. Congress, how is it that we can go on and just let things like that pass by? And a senator from Alabama named Tommy Tuberville, who was the coach at Auburn University before he decided to run for Senate in Alabama, can hold up numerous positions, 273 posts of the U.S. military, because he's angry that the Secretary of Defense said that people in the U.S. military who wish to have an abortion are permitted to do so and may have to travel to states where it is legal. Are you kidding me? Tommy Tuberville is going to hold up 273 appointments in the United States military and in our State Department because he's angry about the legal pursuing of an abortion if someone in the U.S. military seeks to do that. What are some of our worries? I wanted to get into some of our worries and some of the key points. And again, I didn't mean to make this a rant against Tommy Tuberville, but it's beyond belief. It's just beyond belief that these things are occurring. So let's look at several key things here. Let me find the correct notes that I am looking for. Okay. First of all, there are reasons why the ground attack into Gaza has not yet occurred. And this is important because we know that the Israeli military has been amassing its forces on the border to go into Gaza to try and get into the 350 miles of tunnels that Hamas has. And in a show of dark humor, the Israeli army people call it the Metro because it's 350 miles of tunnels. And those tunnels were able to get weapons in and out of Egypt, underground, in this elaborate labyrinth of tunnels. And Israel has said their goal is to go into Gaza, to take Gaza City, and to try and to destroy as much of the tunnel system as possible to keep Hamas from getting weapons again. Let's also keep in mind that there are 4 reasons for the postponement or delay thus far of the ground invasion. Reason number one is the U.S. wants more time for hostage negotiations. Just today, 2 more hostages were released, so there are 4. And the United States has said that with Israel, they believe Hamas may release about 50 hostages who are citizens of another country, and a ground invasion could make hostage releases less likely. So part of it has been the United States asking for more time to attempt to get more hostages released. Reason number 2 is that President Biden is worried about this becoming a wider conflict in the region, potentially including Iran. And American officials want more time to prepare in case of an attack from Iran-backed groups, like Hezbollah in the north, and even Iranian-backed groups in Syria, which is why Israel hit some of the airports in Damascus and has also hit sites in Lebanon. Why? Because Hezbollah uses that as their ground, and because if any of these groups were to take off from Syria, they would use those runways from those airports. So in the meantime, President Biden and the State Department has evacuated some government people, most of our people, at our embassy in Baghdad. And the US Pentagon is sending more missile defense systems to Israel because of the rocket attacks, not only from Gaza, but also from Lebanon into northern Israel. And time is needed to get some of those US defense systems, those anti-missile systems, to the region and to Israel. Number 3 reason is aid. US officials have stressed the importance of being able to give more food and water and medicine to Palestinian civilians in southern Gaza. And on a call yesterday, Biden and Netanyahu agreed there will now be continued flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Finally, number 4, strategy. Biden has advised Israel to avoid the mistakes the US made after 9/11, when, enraged after an attack, the US pursued a war in Afghanistan and made mistakes. Urban warfare in Gaza's streets will be incredibly difficult. And the US is hopeful that Israel will first take the time to weaken Hamas through airstrikes, and then plan a successful campaign that can minimize both casualties amongst the Israeli soldiers and amongst Palestinian civilians. The thing about Afghanistan for the United States and the lessons we've been trying to convey to our friends in Israel are that a long war is ahead against guerrilla fighting. Because in Afghanistan, the United States was able to hit the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, but it took a long time to slowly go after them town by town and try to take away their ability to ever mount another attack against us. Keep in mind, where did the Taliban flee to after the United States came into Afghanistan? Pakistan. And Hamas will try to flee into Egypt from tunnels. That is what we expect them to try and do. They will attempt to flee from Gaza into Egypt to attack Israel again. Keep in mind, the US fought 2 wars. After 9/11, we not only went into Afghanistan, but as I've spoken many times here, the worst US decision was to go into Iraq a year and a half later. And Hezbollah is counting on when Israel invades Gaza to attack northern Israel to create a 2-front war. That is what they are trying to do. I thought Anthony Blinken, when he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu last week, said something that was very profound. He said, "You may be strong enough on your own to defend yourself, but as long as America exists, you will never, ever have to." The United States has sent 10 ships to the region. The USS Gerald Ford, one of our aircraft carriers, and by the way, Gerald Ford, who was such a nice man, gets a US aircraft carrier and guided missile ships and cruisers and destroyers all named after him. But the USS Gerald Ford is there to prevent more missile attacks from Israel, from Hezbollah into Israel. It's already cut off some of the rockets that were being fired. It's also there to send Iran a message that if they attempt to get involved in this, the United States is there and can keep them at bay. And more ships are on the way. Now, fascinating how China believes that somehow they can take advantage of this moment, and Russia's Vladimir Putin thinks this is fantastic because now the world isn't watching what he is doing and the horrific things he has done in the Ukraine. And think about this. Who does Hamas and Hezbollah have behind them? Iran? But also, it seems now we're hearing lip service from Russia, from China. Well, those are enormous mistakes made by those countries. It's one thing to say, we hope that the civilians, the Palestinian civilians, and the casualties will be as low as possible. We are hopeful that Israel will exercise restraint in certain areas. But to come out and support Hamas, it's a sign, the United States military presence, for Iran and groups such as Hezbollah to stay out. And it's a very important sign. And Iran has to realize that if they're going to try and get somehow an advantage from this and intervene and provide weapons to Hezbollah, because that's what everyone fears, that Iran is going to provide Hezbollah with so many weapons, they're going to attempt to fire so many rockets into northern Israel that some of them will penetrate the Iron Dome. Iran must be made to pay for that if they continue to attempt that strategy. The other point that's very important here is that what happened on October 7th illustrated some mistakes in strategy that were made by Israel, by the intelligence and IDF. And some of those, I think, are important for us to highlight because Hamas sent drones to actually blow up some of the Israeli military cell towers and surveillance towers which are there on the border. That prevented the army from having video cameras, and the drones also were destroying remote-controlled machine guns that Israel had installed on the border, which meant that suddenly Israel's cell phones, videos were all basically knocked out. And for years, Israel decided that they could basically count on technology to allow them to have less soldiers on the border with Gaza and put more soldiers on the border with Lebanon for fear that Hezbollah was the biggest threat. And the thing that's important is Israel's national security advisor, Mr. Hanegi, said in a radio interview 1 week before the assault that Hamas is being restrained and Hamas understands the implications of another attack. And he again pointed out that the biggest danger was in Israel's northern border from Hezbollah. they had believed that Hamas was deterred. And they believed that because Islamic Jihad were the people attacking Israel or trying to attack Israel the last 18 months, that Hamas really wasn't preparing anything. However, much like when the United States received intelligence about Pearl Harbor the morning of, and it was ignored, now we're starting to get reports that Israel had received warnings from Egypt and also from its own intelligence that Hamas had been doing some strange movements in the region the day before. What happened, though, after that, again, is an act of pure evil. Because by breaking through the fence, 1,500 Hamas terrorists surged through 30 points on the border. And that was a terrorist attack, again, that left the entire nation of Israel stunned, shocked, as it did the United States after September 11th. And when an attack like that happens, it fundamentally changes history. It does. And so we are at a tipping point in the Middle East. It still does not change the fact that the other Arab countries, as far as their leaders, their governments, do not see Israel as a threat, did not want to pursue any kind of confrontation. Israel had been trading, had been selling and buying from these countries more and more every day. I was here a few years ago where I gave a talk about Saudi Arabia and Israel becoming closer allies against the threat of Iran. And that was true throughout the Middle East. Jordan, Egypt, UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia had no issue with Israel. They were buying and selling technology, buying and selling cell phones, buying and selling. Trade was happening. And Hamas was close to being out of business because they're a terrorist organization, and when terrorists have peace, they're out of business. And remember, my friends, that after the Oslo Agreement, which Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat signed on the White House lawn in 1993, the stipulation after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated was that Oslo would become the agreement would take hold, and there would be a Palestinian country in the West Bank and Gaza on one condition: that there were no terrorist attacks by the Palestinians for 5 years. And Hamas didn't want that peace to take hold, so they sabotaged it. They sabotaged their own Palestinian brethren. They sabotaged the PLO, which had made that peace with Israel. Yasser Arafat was going to be, in 1993, the next Anwar Sadat, and make peace with Israel. And Hamas did a terrorist attack because they were going to be put out of business. The Palestinians were going to be able to basically be worried about building up their own nation. And Israel was going to be promised by the PLO that in exchange for a Palestinian state, there would be peace and no violence. And then, of course, the extremists. And this is what is so frustrating, is when the extremists push the narrative of history. And Hamas devastated Oslo. And in the last 20 years, extremists, even in Israel from the right wing, have become part of government, while the moderates keep being pushed aside. And the Palestinian Authority keeps being pushed aside, and a terrorist group, which has devastated their own people. Think about this. What Hamas did was devastating to their own people. It did not help their cause. It did not help their people. It did not help history for them. Finally, I'd also like to offer a purely gut level emotion after the events of October 7th, and that is disgust. Not only about the attack, of course, but also at the disgust by the reaction. By some, I considered ideologically aligned with me on many issues, because the reaction was by some not outrage at the indiscriminate slaughter of Israeli civilians, but looking at that atrocity and then wanting to blame Israel or engage in the what about, to me was unbelievable. There is a time if you want to debate issues, if you want to debate security, politics, but the reaction by some after that, to me, was a lesson in anti-Semitism that I never wanted. And even on college campuses, again, freedom of speech is cherished, but hate speech, and so we continue on. We will see history continue to be shaped in the coming weeks and months. And like 9/11, we will continue to see many people analyzing what happened, why it happened. But always remember that the terrorists never want peace. At their raison d'etre is evil, is death. And one of the most profound things I saw was Israel will defend itself and hopefully will also exercise at times restraint so that it is not dragged into the same cesspool as has been put in front of it. At this point, I'd like to conclude my remarks and open it up more for discussion rather than questions and answers, if that would be acceptable to everybody. Thank you very much. And before anything, I have to thank the sainted Mother Lumish, because she is my good luck charm. Every time she's ever come to one of my talks, it's brought me nothing but good fortune. So when her son Adam told me that she would be in the audience tonight, I knew everything would be much better. So thank you. Yes.
It's going to be a question, not a discussion, because you're the only one that will know this answer. Do you have this discussion at Mount Lebanon High School? And what, I mean, young people, including my 27 and 30-year-old, one of which is an Israeli citizen, my son, who was very much against the Israeli government and all that, has had a change of heart, and sadly in the last 2 weeks, but they kind of didn't get it. Now they're getting it. But can you get through to this generation that is so progressive in thinking and make them understand that, two things can be right. Israel can be the target of all this stuff. And yes, there are innocent Palestinians in Gaza who will be collateral damage, and they're both bad. They're not. But what's the reaction from the young people that you talk to?
Well, it's mixed. And the day after that Monday, when I taught it, I said we're gonna look at this in different ways. If you are talking about what Hamas just did, that's a massacre of the innocent. There is a time and a place for discussion of the Palestinian legitimate complaints about not having a state, about not having a country of their own, how they've been marginalized by the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. who should have supported the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, I think, much more. But let's for a moment, again, after 9/11, even critics of George Bush said, this is not the time for us to analyze US foreign policy. It's the time to come together because we've been attacked. And we have to defend our existential right to live. And so I framed it as, I'm going to teach about what just happened as a massacre of innocent people who did nothing except live. I mean, you can't find more innocent people than on a kibbutz or at a music festival. And that to me was what we should have paid attention to immediately following the massacre. Again, at some point we can have a debate about Netanyahu appealing to the far right and forming this government, and how in Israel there were protests for months against what he had done with the Supreme Court. But when you are unthinkably attacked, and all of the continue to be attacked.
The difference in 9/11 was it was
Right.
there, it was done.
Right.
This is not stopped. They haven't even had time to really grieve
Right.
while they're in their bomb shelter.
Right. And I tried to impress upon my students. And then after those lessons, I said, let's take a step back. Let's look at the context of the Middle East. We looked at the creation of the State of Israel. We looked at the UN partition plan of 1947. We looked at the Six-Day War of 1967, the Camp David peace agreement in 79. I said, if there's one thing to think about, after the Yom Kippur War of 73, Yasser Arafat went several years later to the Israeli Knesset and gave a speech and reached out to Golda Meir and then made peace with Menachem Begin. And in 1993, in Oslo, Norway, you had Israeli and Palestinians sit down and negotiate the Oslo Agreement. And I also pointed out that every war that Israel has fought, it was attacked. Every war that Israel has fought in the Middle East, it was attacked. In 1948, in 1956, in 1973, it just keeps going and going and going. And so, a good friend of mine who used to be the shaliach here in Pittsburgh many years ago, he said, in Israel, everyone's a prime minister. He said, every person has their own view. Every person is their own prime minister. And I never forgot that. There is no one monolithic, what do Israelis think? That's like saying, what do Americans think? Well, let's see. We almost split the last election 50-50, although 7 million more people voted for Joe Biden. I just like to point that out from time to time. But you after a massacre, I was dumbfounded by, again, college campuses saying that somehow, this should have been, what about? And that drove me crazy. Because if you want to argue, okay, the Palestinian point of view of those in the West Bank, that's one thing. But if you want to argue a terrorist group supported by Iran, whose goal is the elimination of the people of Israel, they don't want Israel to exist. This isn't Egypt, this isn't Jordan, this isn't the government of Lebanon, this isn't the Palestinian Authority. This is a terrorist organization, the same as Al-Qaeda wanted to inflict as much damage to the United States and were gleeful when they knocked down the Twin Towers and flew into the Pentagon. They were gleeful. Osama bin Laden said it was better than anything he could have ever imagined. And that's what is just, it's evil. And it's just pure evil. Yes.
To the list of your worries, I want to add one of my biggest worries. As you touched upon it when you mentioned the campuses. The Western democracies joined the United States very quickly in supporting Israel, saying all the right things, but the streets don't. And the demonstrations in Germany, France, in England, millions of people, numbers are very large, and it's spreading, and there's a gap between what the head of states are expressing as political and what's right, and what the street thinks and does. And that, to me, is a very great worry, and we don't see it that much here yet, but I think we're just sitting and waiting. That's all I feel.
Yeah.
I understand that Hamas did not want Saudi Arabia to do the accord with Israel. What do you think their goal was, other than their initial attack? What was their outcome? What were they looking at 3, 4, 5 months, a year down the road? I mean, did they expect Israel, do you think, to react the way they did? I mean,
Yeah.
where is it? They thought Gaza would be destroyed.
I think they were thinking, if Israel retaliates by bombing us in Gaza, we create martyrs, generations of martyrs. Israel is perceived as the bad guy, and what we can do is then go around to the other Arab countries and say, how can you make peace with these people who are killing us? Hamas wanted to change the narrative away from peace, because think about it. Israel, with all of its Arab neighbors for the last 40 years, has had peace. Think about it. The only countries that could possibly be a threat or attempt to bomb Israel are Iran, with the maniac Assad in Syria. And even he is afraid to do that because Israel has retaliated against Syria. And he's still using chemical weapons on his own people in Syria to keep control on his grip of power. I think Hamas wanted exactly what is happening. I also think they want Israel to do a land invasion because they believe they can fight guerrilla warfare in the tunnels, and they can somehow drag this out into a long, protracted war that somehow makes them seem like they're the Palestinian champions and marginalizes the moderate Palestinians in the West Bank. They also hope that this creates a larger war. They're hopeful that this creates war with Hezbollah attacking in the north, with Palestinians in the West Bank, with Iran or Syria somehow helping them. They have this delusion that somehow this is going to be a wider conflict, and that's what they have wanted all along.
Do you think the U.S. has been stacking the personnel to handle all this?
I'm sorry.
Do you think the U.S. has, I mean, whether it's our ambassadors, the politicians, do you really think the U.S. is capable of handling all these different conflicts coming together? Do we have the staff?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. The United States is terrible at being proactive. We always have been. We're extraordinary at being reactive. That was the case with Afghanistan. That was the case with World War II. That was the case when we went into the Gulf War in '91. I mean, people like to attack the United States, diminish the United States. The United States is still by far the leading economic and military power in the world. I mean, President Biden went to Israel and promised billions of dollars in aid to Israel and $100 million to the Palestinians in Gaza with relief supplies like that. I'm sorry?
It has to be approved, so. He can promise it hasn't been approved yet.
Well, let's hold out hope that the Tommy Tubervilles and the elusive Speaker of the House could possibly happen in the next few days. It will. There's bipartisan support. I haven't heard too many voices except for the extreme sort of, far fringe in our own government, Congress, that has offered anything as far as wanting to oppose that. Keep in mind this also. The United States not only sent the USS Gerald Ford to the Middle East, but we also sent US carriers, US ships to the South China Sea to send a message to North Korea and China. What I worry about is China somehow thinking while the United States is involved with Ukraine and in support of Israel, that this would be a great time for China to attempt to launch some kind of an attack against Taiwan. I worry about that. And people ask me all the time, Savarese, how do you sleep at night? I say, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every hour and a half crying.
A few comments. When you talk about extremism, lessons learned in our own government. We have extremists in one party that have been keeping so many appointments from happening. Why we don't have the ambassadors, why we don't have some of the judges in place, why we don't have the appointments of what we should have in the armed forces, okay? On the other part, I was disgusted to hear this morning that the more social left side of the Democratic Party now feels very abandoned by Biden for his statements. I don't know if you saw that this morning, because of the support for Israel. And what about the Palestinians? And you become more and more fearful in the United States of the extremism that's happening in either party and some of the implications that we're seeing. And you say, okay, lessons learned, we saw this happen in the Republican Party, we better damn well be careful in the Democratic Party, okay? Next, many people have analyzed some of this as saying what you were saying is why the attack now and what's going on. People feel that the agreements that were forthcoming, that were going to be coming with Saudi Arabia, really pushed this over. That they were so upset that more and more it was becoming peaceful, that this was the time to attack. And then my last comment on extremism and everything else you said is with China. You're 100%, I mean, in my perception, 100% right, that China will look for this as an opportunity, as our gates being down, because we are so involved with Israel, and we are so involved with different,
Ukraine.
wars that are happening, right, with Ukraine, that they are going to take this opportunity. The last piece I'll say to you that brings me great relief is that we do have a government, we do have people at the State Department in these positions that are really the example of diplomats and that are educated, they understand really what shuffle diplomacy means. And we also now have a State Department that during World War II, many said was anti-Semitic. And we absolutely do not have that any longer. So those are the great prides we can take, but we're always going to be facing all of this extremism. And it is how we cannot keep our thumb off of any one of these areas that you discussed. My comments, open for discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing I was going to say is, in answer to what you're saying, is the only way to keep our government working for us is vote.
Absolutely.
Get these Looney Tunes out of there.
And vote in the primary. Show up in the primary.
Absolutely.
Open primaries.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's vitally important now more than ever.
After the war, we're talking about the afterwards. Israel cannot just fuck up and leave.
Yeah. There are so many scenarios of what could happen. If we want to use history, Israel will be in Gaza for some time, and several roads could follow. One, they do damage to Hamas. They take out many of the underground tunnels. They get help from Egypt in managing it, and they then look at a victory in dismantling Hamas, and always, unfortunately, going to have to keep the border between Gaza and Israel more fortified and better to prevent any other things like this. This could become years of being bogged down in Gaza. I think that the lessons of the United States and Afghanistan are you have to have very clear goals. Clearly, what is Israel's intention? To take out Hamas's leadership, to try and dismantle the underground tunnels, to try and make Hamas's ability to strike Israel again very, very negligible. And like we went into Afghanistan, to have it, but we didn't have an exit strategy. Colin Powell used to say, before you go into any military operation, have an exit strategy. How and in what way are you going to get out? And Israel has to have that. I think Biden urging them to take their time and figure out the strategy instead of wanting to react now is a prudent course. It's the right course. Wait. If you have to wait another week or 2 weeks, because once you are in Gaza, then it becomes guerrilla warfare. It becomes fighting on the ground, going into tunnels. And at what point do you say, if you're Israel, what is our ability to get out? What is our exit strategy to get out? And if you're in Israel, at what point do the Israeli people, after a year of occupation, 2 years of occupation, at what point do they say, we don't wish to be a permanent, presence, the same way Israel went into Lebanon? Let's remember, in the 1980s, when you had these militias from Lebanon firing into Israel, right? And Israel went into Lebanon to try and force them out and got bogged down in Lebanon for years. And finally said, okay, we've taken care of the threat. We can't, there's no panacea. There's no 100% solution. There's no magic elixir. But we can make the threat much, much lower. And we can understand that technology is not going to be the way to stop, a group like Hamas or Hezbollah, because Israel was very high tech. And what Hamas did was considerably low tech in their attack.
The Zoom has been very, very active. There are a lot of people watching on Zoom. So do you want a small sampling of comments?
Sure.
Or questions from the Zoomers?
Of course.
All right, so here's the first one. Assuming a ground attack into Gaza, what is the end game? What replaces Hamas? Do you foresee Arab nations stepping up to help support creation of a non-terrorist government in Gaza?
Yeah, well, that's a great point. What do the Arab nations do? Well, at first, they're going to be, as you said, in the streets of Arab capitals. You're going to see demonstrations against Israel. You're going to see all of that. At what point do the Arab countries say, we are going to actually help? Saudi Arabia, with all of its money, creating a separate Gulf League in the United States, with all that money, why couldn't they, funnel it into humanitarian projects in the West Bank or Gaza? Egypt, all these years, what really have they been doing to make Gaza a better place? There's plenty of criticism to go around, but that's a great question. What do the Arab countries do once things in 6 months, in a year? Typically, Saudi Arabia, to keep the Palestinians from not having refugees leaving, the same with Egypt and Jordan, will give them money to attempt to rebuild. And that becomes a big question. What would the Arabs do in this situation? How will they play a part in this whole process?
Because they hate the Palestinians more than the Israelis.
Yeah, but they're afraid. I think they're afraid.
They may be afraid.
I think in all the Arab capitals, but I think in all the Arab capitals, they're worried that there will be protests and perhaps pressure. And again, they would love to just brush it under the rug, but I don't think they can do it this time. I don't know. I don't know. Yes.
Who will run Gaza after Hamas is eliminated, and how long do you think Israel will stay in Gaza?
Well, this may come as a surprise, but I don't have a crystal ball. Who will run Gaza?
But you have so many people with such hatred towards Israel because of their innocence being taken, their bombs on them and their lives. Aren't you just creating another generation of Hamas? where will the leadership be? I mean, I don't see where they're gonna have a leadership coming up that's willing to make peace, that's willing to put aside the hatred and the hardship that they're going through.
I don't disagree with you. I think there is going to be a generation of people that will be ripe for the picking for Hamas. I think there will also be a generation of Israelis who will not want to live side by side with the Palestinians. This is why I have been in such despair the last few weeks, because every time there has been a war in the Middle East, in time, things actually were healed. I mean, after the 1967 Six-Day War, right? Who would have thought Israel was going to make peace with Egypt, was going to make peace with Jordan? Who would have thought that in 2023, before October 7th, we would be talking about Saudi Arabia and Israel having mutual interests? Who would have thought all that? But no, we don't know where it's going. It's fraught with gigantic potholes. But I can say this, when you allow the extremists to set the narrative, to set history, to make the decisions, what usually happens is disaster.
What's going to happen in Israel after the war, internally?
That's another great question I don't have an answer for. What's going to happen in Israel internally after the war? I don't know. I think there's going to be anger among some Israelis at Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think they're going to see some of the failures of Israel's intelligence as being failures of the government of Israel. I think right now there's going to be unity. But you're right. What happens after the war? That's an enormous question. At what point does the Israeli population start to see shifts as well? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Anybody who stands up and says, let me tell you what's going to happen in Israel after the war, is trying to sell you something. The honest answer is we don't know. The honest answer is we hope that what will happen is the other Arab countries will decide they want to be part of some peaceful solution. But the other part is, how long will it take for people to heal from what happened? I mean, that's to me so hard. Bernice, you are the moderator.
We will let the Zoomers have the last word.
Okay.
One last question.
Sure.
Okay. What gives you hope right now in this situation?
What gives you hope in this situation? What gives me hope is that after 1973, people were saying, oh my God, after the Yom Kippur War, there's going to be nothing but more war. And after 1973, Anwar Sadat shocked the world when he decided, I would rather have peace with Israel and get the Sinai back than to pursue constant war. And where did Oslo come from? All of a sudden, after the end of the Cold War, Israelis and Palestinians met in Norway, not anywhere in the Middle East. They went to Norway and they negotiated. What gives me peace is that in the midst of all this suffering, you have people who are saying the only thing that can possibly create a different world is for an end to senseless violence. And perhaps that's why we're in a place like this, where we hope to God that in the future we learn. And we hope that maybe in a small way, we look back on this in history and say, once again, a tragedy, a war, was the impetus for people finally deciding to have peace. Thank you all very much. Thanks, Bernice.
Thank you, George, for your thoughtful and clear-headed analysis of today's news. We thank you all for coming here and on Zoom. We will see you next Monday for Judge Klein, and then the following Shabbat when we introduce a new adult ed learning opportunity during services. No, that's not right. Oh, November 6th is Judge Arnie? Okay, all right, 2 weeks from tonight. Thank you, 2 weeks, okay. Please don't forget to sign up for lunch when the Pittsburgh Opera Company comes to Bethel for First Mondays on November 6th.
Can I come?
Yes, please.
Wow.
Yes,
Will they sing the Barber of Seville
I hope so.
from Bugs Bunny? Sorry.
It might be during your lunch hour. Yes. Sponsored by Karen and Marshall Balk. See you all then. Good night.